Every single day, trillions of dollars change hands across the globe. And I mean trillions, not millions, not billions, trillions. In fact, around $7 trillion is traded in foreign exchange markets every single day. That's more than the entire GDP of Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined, moving through the global financial system in 24 hours. Oil, gold, coffee, copper, weapons, grain, almost everything that gets bought and sold between countries is priced in one currency. Not euros, not the British pound, not China's yuan, dollars. The United States dollars, a piece of paper, or more accurately these days, a number on a screen controlled by one central bank. In one country, that makes up about 4% of the world's population. So here's the question that should be keeping you up at night. Why? Why does America get to be the banker of the entire world? How did this happen? Who agreed to it? And what happens to your mortgage, your petrol prices, your supermarket bill when the U.S. makes decisions about its own currency? And perhaps most importantly, is this system starting to crack? By the end of this video, you'll understand one of the most powerful and least talked about forces shaping your daily life. Let's start at the very beginning. Before we get into the history, we need to understand what a reserve currency actually is, because it's one of those terms that gets thrown around in news headlines without anyone properly explaining it. A reserve currency is a currency that governments and central banks around the world hold in large quantities as part of their foreign exchange reserves. Think of it like a savings account that countries keep, but instead of saving their own money, they save someone else. Why would a country save another country's money? Great question. Because international trade doesn't work like going to the local market. When Japan wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, Japan can't just hand over Japanese yen and call it a day. Saudi Arabia doesn't want yen. What would they do with it? They'd have to convert it, deal with exchange rate risk, and navigate a whole mess of complications. Instead, both countries agree to transact in a common currency. A neutral language of money, if you like. And for the past 80 years, that language has been the US dollar. This means that if you're a central bank in Indonesia, in Nigeria, in Brazil, in South Korea, you need to hold a stockpile of US dollars at all times, because at any moment you might need to buy oil, or pay off an international debt, or stabilize your own currency on global markets. And for all of those things, you need dollars. Right now, approximately 60% of all foreign exchange reserves held by central banks around the world are in US dollars. The euro comes in second at around 20%. Every other currency, the yen, the pound, the yuan, splits the remaining 20% between them. That is an extraordinary concentration of financial power in the hands of one country. And to understand how it happened, we have to go back to 1944 to a hotel in a small mountain town in New Hampshire where the modern financial world was literally invented over 3 weeks of negotiations. It's July 1944. World War II is still raging. The D-Day landings in Normandy happened just a month earlier. The war in the Pacific is brutal, but already the Allied powers are starting to think about what comes after. What does the world look like when this is all over? And more specifically, how do you rebuild a global economy that has been shattered by 15 years of Great Depression and war? 730 delegates from 44 nations descended on the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They were there to design a new international monetary system from scratch. A context matters enormously. Before World War I, the world had operated on something called the gold standard. Every major currency was directly backed by physical gold. A British pound represented a specific amount of gold. A French franc represented a specific amount of gold. This created stability. You always knew what a currency was worth because it was anchored to something real and finite. But the gold standard had a fatal weakness. If a country needed to spend more money than it had gold, which happens during wars and depressions, it couldn't. It was trapped. Countries abandoned the gold standard one by one during the Great Depression of the 1930s, as when they desperately needed to print money and stimulate their economies. The result was chaos. Currencies fluctuated wildly. Countries engaged in what economists call competitive devaluation, deliberately weakening their own currency to make exports cheaper, triggering retaliatory devaluations from everyone else. International trade collapsed. The global economy seized up. The economists and diplomats at Bretton Woods were determined not to repeat this. They needed a system that provided stability like the gold standard, but also gave countries enough flexibility to manage their own economies. A solution they came up with was elegant. Every currency in the world would be pegged to the US dollar at a fixed exchange rate. And the US dollar alone would be backed by gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. So every currency was indirectly backed by gold, but only through the dollar. The dollar? Because America had won the war, or at least had played the decisive role in winning it, while suffering far less physical destruction than Europe or Asia. America's factories were intact. Its cities hadn't been bombed. Its farmland was producing. And critically, the United States held approximately 70% of the world's monetary gold reserves at the time. No other country came close. The arrangement worked brilliantly for nearly 3 decades. The 1950s and 1960s saw extraordinary global economic growth. Europe rebuilt. Japan industrialized at breathtaking speed. International trade expanded. The dollar was the rock upon which the entire system rested. But there was a problem building under the surface, a fatal flaw that would eventually bring the whole structure down. In 1960, a Belgian-American economist named Robert Triffin stood before the U.S. Congress and delivered a warning that nobody wanted to hear. He said, "The Bretton Woods system contains a fundamental contradiction that will eventually destroy itself. Here's the logic. For the global economy to grow, the world needs more and more dollars to use in international trade. More trade means more transactions, which means more dollars are needed to lubricate the system. The only way to get more dollars into the world is for the United States to run a trade deficit to import more than it exports. Sending dollars flowing out to the rest of the world. But, and here's the catch, if America runs persistent trade deficits, it accumulates debt. other countries start holding more and more dollars. And at some point, they start wondering, does America actually have enough gold to back all these dollars? Can we really go to Washington and exchange our dollars for gold at $35 an ounce? The answer, by the late 1960s, was clearly no. The U.S. had been spending massively on the Vietnam War and on Lyndon Johnson's Great Society social programs at home. The amount of dollars in circulation around the world had grown far beyond what America's gold reserves could cover. France under Charles de Gaulle was particularly suspicious and started actually sending ships across the Atlantic to New York, demanding physical gold in exchange for their dollar reserves. They were essentially calling America's bluff. This was the Triffin dilemma. The world needed America to create dollars, but creating too many dollars undermined confidence in those dollars. It was a trap with no clean escape. In 1971, President Richard Nixon sprung the trap. On the evening of Sunday, August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon interrupted regular television programming to make an announcement that would fundamentally change the global financial system. He told the world that the United States was suspending the convertibility of the dollar to gold. Effective immediately, the dollar would no longer be backed by physical gold. It would float freely on currency markets, its value determined by supply and demand and the confidence of markets in the American economy. Nixon framed this as a temporary measure. It was, of course, permanent. The gold standard in any form was dead. The era of fiat currency had begun. Fiat currency means a currency backed by nothing except the authority and credibility of the government that issues it. The dollar is valuable because people, governments, banks, businesses, individuals around the world believe it is valuable and act accordingly. It's a shared fiction that works because everyone participates in it. Now, you might think this would have caused the dollar to collapse. If gold backing was removed, why would anyone trust the dollar? Why would foreign governments keep holding it? Reasons. First, there was simply no alternative. What would you replace it with? The British pound was a shadow of its former self. The German mark and Japanese yen were the currencies of recently defeated enemies that were still occupied by American troops. There was nothing else with the size, the liquidity, and the institutional infrastructure that the dollar had built over the previous 25 years. Second, and this is where the story gets truly fascinating, the United States had already been quietly building the next pillar of dollar dominating. Something that would prove even more powerful than the gold link. Something that would tie the world to the dollar not through a formal treaty, but through pure economic necessity. Now, to understand the petrodollar, you need to understand what the early 1970s looked like. In 1973, the Arab members of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, launched an oil embargo against the United States in retaliation for American support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The price of oil quadrupled almost overnight. Petrol stations in America had lines stretching around the block. The U.S. economy was thrown into chaos. It was a brutal demonstration of how dependent the modern world had become on Middle Eastern oil. And it forced a reckoning in Washington. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to Saudi Arabia in 1974 with a deal in his pocket. The details of exactly what was agreed have never been fully declassified, but the broad outlines are well established. America offered Saudi Arabia something invaluable: security guarantees, military equipment, and protection from its enemies, including an implicit promise to defend the Saudi royal family's grip on power. In exchange, Saudi Arabia agreed to do two things: price all of its oil exports exclusively in US dollars, and invest its surplus oil revenues, the billions of dollars flowing in from oil sales, into two U.S. Treasury bonds. This arrangement was then extended to the other OPEC members. The petrodollar system was born. Think about what this meant. Every country on earth needs oil. There are no exceptions, not in the 1970s, not today. To buy oil, you need dollars. To get dollars, you need to either earn them through trade or borrow them. This created an automatic, permanent, structural demand for US dollars from every single economy on earth. Not because of a treaty, not because of a formal agreement, simply because the most essential commodity in the industrial world was priced in dollars, and those dollars didn't just disappear. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states were earning more money than they could possibly spend domestically. Where did the surplus go? Back into U.S. Treasury bonds, back into American financial markets, effectively funding American government spending at very low interest rates. It was, depending on your perspective, either a stroke of geopolitical genius or the most audacious financial scheme in history. Probably both. Now let's bring this down to earth, because everything I've described so far might sound like abstract geopolitics, but the dollar's reserve currency status has very direct, very concrete effects on your daily life, whether you live in Australia, Australia, Indonesia, Nigeria, or anywhere else outside the United States. Let's start with the most fundamental effect: the price of oil, because oil is priced in dollars. When the dollar strengthens, meaning each dollar buys more of other currencies, oil becomes relatively more expensive for countries whose currency isn't the dollar. Australia buys almost all of its imported oil in dollars. If the Australian dollar weakens against the US dollar, petrol prices in Australia go up. Not because oil itself got more expensive, but because the dollar got stronger. This is a mechanism by which American monetary policy directly affects the cost of filling up your car in Canberra. The U.S. Federal Reserve raises interest rates, which tends to strengthen the dollar, and within weeks, Australians are paying more at the pump. You had no vote in that decision. You had no say whatsoever, but you feel it. The same mechanism runs through almost everything imported: electronics, medicines, aircraft parts, most consumer goods, all priced internationally in dollars. Dollar strength means higher import costs. Higher import costs mean higher prices in your local supermarket, your local pharmacy, your local electronics store. Now let's talk about debt. Many developing nations borrow money internationally from banks, from bond markets, from the IMF in US dollars. This seems logical because dollar loans are often cheaper and more easily available. But it creates a catastrophic vulnerability. If your country earns its revenue in local currency, say Kenyan shillings, or Egyptian pounds, or Sri Lankan rupees, but your debt is in dollars, you are permanently exposed to currency risk. If your local currency weakens against the dollar, your debt burden increases. Not because you borrowed more money, simply because the exchange rate moved. This has caused real, devastating economic collapses. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis wiped out decades of economic progress across Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, and other countries, largely because their dollar-denominated debts became unpayable when their currencies collapsed. In 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted entirely, partly driven by dollar-denominated debt that became crushing as the rupee weakened. Argentina has experienced this cycle of dollar debt crisis and currency collapse so many times it has become almost a national ritual. The irony is devastating. These countries borrowed in dollars because it was cheaper and more available. But the dollar's reserve currency status is precisely what made their debt so dangerous, because they had no control over the currency in which they owed money. For Australians, the exposure is somewhat less severe because Australia is a wealthy country with strong institutions and a floating currency. But it is not zero. Australian businesses that import goods, Australian governments that issue international bonds, Australian banks that access global capital markets, all of them navigate a world where the dollar sets the rules. In 1965, French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing used a phrase that has echoed through economics ever since. He called the dollar's reserve currency status America's exorbitant privilege. What did he mean? He meant that the United States gets to do something no other country on earth can do. It gets to borrow money in its own currency, essentially without limit, at very low interest rates, and the world has no choice but to accept this. When America needs to spend more than it earns, which it has done almost every year for decades, it issues treasury bonds. It borrows, but it borrows in dollars. And because the whole world needs dollars, there is always a buyer for those bonds. The demand is structural and nearly infinite. America's national debt is now over $33 trillion. That is a number so large it is essentially meaningless to the human brain. $33,000 billion. If you spent $1 million a day, it would take you over 90,000 years to spend that amount. Any other country with that level of debt relative to its economy would face a currency crisis, soaring interest rates, and potential economic collapse. Investors would flee. The currency would plummet. The IMF would be on the phone with harsh conditions attached. But America keeps borrowing, and the world keeps lending. Because where else are you going to put your money? What other asset is as liquid, as safe, as universally accepted as U.S. Treasury bonds? There is nothing else at that scale. This is the exorbitant privilege. America lives beyond its means and exports the consequences to everyone else. When America prints money, it dilutes the value of all the dollars held in reserve by every other country in the world. Every central bank that holds dollars effectively pays a small, invisible tax every time the U.S. increases its money supply. Giscard d'Estaing was frustrated by this in 1965. His frustration would find many echoes in the decades that followed. There is one more dimension of dollar power that has become increasingly important in recent years. And it is one that is actively reshaping geopolitics right now. The dollar as a weapon. Because almost all international financial transactions, including transactions between two countries that have nothing to do with the United States, are processed through American financial infrastructure. specifically through a system called SWIFT and through American correspondent banks. The United States has the ability to cut any country off from the global financial system. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the U.S. and its allies responded by removing Russia from the SWIFT system and freezing approximately $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions. Overnight, Russia's ability to conduct international transactions was severely curtailed. This was an unprecedented use of financial power. No military action. No bombs. Just a decision in Washington, and a major economy was partly severed from the global financial system. The message was not lost on Beijing or Tehran or Riyadh or anywhere else that might someday find itself on the wrong side of American foreign policy. If your reserves are in dollars and your transactions run through American infrastructure, you are permanently vulnerable to American contagion. The dollar is not just a currency. In American hands, it is a geopolitical weapon of enormous power. This brings us to the question everyone is asking right now. Is the dollar's position as the world's reserve currency under serious threat? The honest answer is, more than it was 10 years ago, but less than some headlines suggest. Let's look at what's actually happening. China has been systematically building the infrastructure to internationalize its currency, the yuan, for over a decade. It has established yuan-denominated trading hubs in Hong Kong, London, and Singapore. It has signed currency swap agreements with dozens of countries, allowing them to trade directly in yuan without converting through dollars. It launched a digital yuan, a central bank digital currency, partly designed to enable international transactions that bypass dollar-based infrastructure. In March 2023, China and Brazil announced they would settle trade directly in yuan and RMB, no dollars involved. Saudi Arabia has held discussions about accepting yuan for Chinese oil purchases, though no definitive deal has been announced. Russia, cut off from dollar systems, has pivoted dramatically toward the yuan for international trade. Chinese yuan trading volumes in Moscow, have exploded. Since 20 are the BRICS nations, which have now expanded to include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, have explicitly discussed creating a new reserve currency or a common payment system that operates independently of dollar. At their 2023 summit, de-dollarization was a central theme. But here is where we need to pump the brakes and look at the data rather than the rhetoric. Despite all of this, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has barely moved. It declined from around 66% a decade ago to around 58% today. That is a decline, yes, but it is a gradual one, and the yuan share remains below 3%. 3%, after a decade of China's best efforts to internationalize its currency. Why is it so hard to displace the dollar? Because reserve currency status isn't just about political will. It requires deep, liquid financial markets where you can invest trillions of dollars safely and access them at any time. It requires rule of law and confidence that the government won't arbitrarily seize assets. It requires a freely convertible currency, meaning anyone can buy and sell it without government controls. China fails on the last point entirely. The yuan is not freely convertible. China maintains strict capital controls limits on how much money can flow in and out of the country. This is not an oversight. It is a deliberate policy choice that allows China to maintain control over its own economy. But it makes the yuan fundamentally unsuitable as a global reserve currency. You cannot hold a currency in reserve if you cannot freely convert it. There is also the matter of what you do with your reserves once you have them. If a central bank holds yuan, where does it invest them? China's government bond market is large but not as liquid or as open as the U.S. Treasury market. There is no yuan-denominated asset that can absorb trillions of dollars of central bank money the way U.S. Treasuries can. So the dollar is not about to be toppled, but it is also not as unchallengeable as it once was. The weaponization of the dollar through sanctions has motivated many countries to quietly build alternatives, not to replace the dollar but to reduce their dependence on it over time. This is a slow, structural shift rather than a dramatic collapse. It is worth asking because the answer reveals both the benefits and the costs of the current system. In a world with a more multipolar reserve currency system where the dollar shares status with the euro, the yuan, and perhaps a few others, several things would change. The United States would lose its exorbitant privilege, edge. It would no longer be able to borrow unlimited amounts at artificially low rates. It would face harder budget constraints. American consumers, who have benefited for decades from cheap imports partly enabled by the dollar's strength, would face higher prices. But for the rest of the world, particularly developing nations, a more multipolar system might mean more options, less vulnerability, and less exposure to the side effects of American monetary autocracy. The countries that suffered most from dollar-denominated debt crises might have more flexibility to borrow in alternative currencies, reducing their exposure. Whether this transition happens smoothly or chaotically is one of the defining economic questions of the coming decade. History suggests that transitions of global reserve currency status are rarely orderly. When the British pound lost its reserve currency status to the dollar in the mid-20th century, it took place over decades of relative British economic decline, 2 world wars, and the dissolution of the British Empire. The process was painful. Transition away from dollar dominance, if it comes, is likely to be similarly messy. So, what do you actually do with this information? First, understand that your economic life is more connected to American decisions than your politicians will ever tell you. When the U.S. Federal Reserve meets to set interest rates, pay attention. When the dollar strengthens or weakens, understand that your cost of living will move accordingly. These are not abstract events happening far away. They show up in your mortgage rate, your grocery bill, your energy costs. Second, if you have savings, think about currency diversification. Most Australians hold their savings entirely in Australian dollars. But the Australian dollar is volatile relative to the US dollar and is heavily influenced by commodity prices and Chinese demand. Understanding this exposure is the first step to managing it. Watch the de-dollarization story closely. It will not happen overnight, but the trajectory is clear. Countries are building alternatives. The system is evolving. Understanding these shifts puts you ahead of 95% of people who simply assume the world will always work the way it works. Todd, the US dollar's dominance is not a law of nature. It is a historical accident, reinforced by deliberate policy, protected by military power, and sustained by the absence of a credible alternative. All of those factors are slowly, quietly changing. The US dollar is more than money. It is the operating system of the global economy. Every transaction, every debt, every act of international trade runs through it in some way. Understanding it means understanding why petrol prices rise when America raises interest rates. Why developing countries go bankrupt when the dollar strengthens. Why Russia was financially wounded without a single shot being fired. Why China's entire foreign policy is partly organized around escaping dollar dependence. This is the hidden architecture of the world you live in. Most people will go their entire lives without understanding it. Now you do. If you found this useful, hit subscribe. Every single week we take one of the world's most complex political or economic systems and explain it clearly. Without jargon, without agenda, just the facts and the story behind them. Next video. What happens when countries actually try to stop using the dollar? We'll look at Iraq, Libya, and what happened to the leaders who seriously challenged the petrodollar. That story is darker and more important than you might expect. I'll see you there.